opportunity. Alexis and I, several years ago, had a conversation because Alexis is one of the pioneers of Afrofuturism. And springboarding off of the exciting conversations she and others had around the legacy of Octavia Butler, I asked her to envision what would reproductive politics look like in a context of Afrofuturism. And of course, every time I ask people these kinds of questions, they bounce them back on me like I'm supposed to know these things. And I'm like, wait a moment, this is why I'm trying to ask y'all. But my thoughts around it, since she did ask me to do my own homework, is I think that the terrain of reproductive politics are shifting even as we talk. And so obviously the way we advocate for reproductive justice is going to necessarily have to shift. One of the questions that reproductive justice poses, for example, is that it's a human rights-based system of accountability and justice. And yet, as we're moving into an era where nation states can no longer be counted on, or if they ever could, as the protectors of human rights and the defenders of human rights, what other rights-based system can we envision that will be necessary to provide the resources or the protections required under reproductive justice? Another question that occurs to me is the changing and evolving definition of what it means to be human. Because we're seeing with the new reproductive technologies and the biopiracy of human DNA that the corporations are doing, that the definition of who owns a body, who owns the parts of the body, what is human even, are being contested and that maybe even evolving. And I think the advent of increasingly sophisticated robotics is even pushing at the question even more. So what does it look like to claim human rights under differing and evolving definitions of humanity? And of course, speaking as someone who has consistently written out of the definition of humanity as descendants of enslaved Africans, this is not a theoretical question, but a real political question for us. And so these are some of the things that I've been thinking about around reproductive futurism. Obviously, I think the politics of abortion are going to change. The access to abortion has already changed with the advent and the distribution, sometimes underneath the radar of the law, of the abortion pills. But really, who is seen as reproducible? What will the whole concept of designer babies do to people who are disabled or marginalized in other kinds of ways? I write science fiction in my spare time, which is non-existent. But in science fiction, we talk about a device that Shulamith Firestone actually predicted, and that's uterine replicators, where gestating a fetus can take place outside of a body. And this technology is really around the corner in terms of the timeline of humanity. And so what will happen to the concept of reproductive labor when reproduction can take place outside of the body and can be easily done by any gender or gender identity or people with the access to that type of technology? And how will you continue to persuade people capable of getting pregnant to put their lives on the line continuously for the future of humanity, when in fact, uterine replicators may make the whole conversation different? When childbirth is no longer a life-risking process and is available to anybody. And so I've got maybe 20 more questions that I sent to Alexis on these types of topics, but I'll stop here so that the students can ponder and discuss some of these ideas that I'm hoping that we can talk about.
Yeah, so maybe we could take a couple of questions at this point. If you would like to ponder and then type in the chat. And we'll just take a minute to do that.
I'm still trying to get used to Zoom teaching and the silences that happen in the middle of Zoom teaching. There's something about it being live that it's kind of like radio, or radio silence is deadly, and it feels like a Zoom silence is deadly. You're supposed to be filling that space with something.
Or would someone like to ask a question just through video? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Well, one question I have to ask of the audience and the students is, what are the signs that neoliberal capitalism is in crisis, particularly with the COVID crisis? And what can we say that it's going to rearrange in the future? I mean, I don't think that they're going to be able to argue that we can't find the money to take care of homeless people or to take care of essential workers when they were able to find over $2 trillion at the drop of a hat to rescue corporate America. And so what will the unfolding crisis of neoliberal capitalism look like? And how will that affect reproductive politics generally? But reproductive justice requires that you look at the conditions under which people make their decisions. So how will the neoliberal unfolding affect those conditions, and what can we do to agitate for them?
How does writing science fiction help you in other aspects of your academic and personal life? How does it interact with your activism?
Well, I've always loved science fiction. One of the things that people don't know about me is that I majored in chemistry and physics as an undergrad. So I've always had a left brain orientation, and I've actually got to feminism calling on my right brain, but it's not a comfortable fit because I really am a linear thinker. And, I actually like science. I come from a family of nerds. And so the way science fiction works in my life presently is that I have to pay so much attention to the real time pain of politics and how people brutalize each other. I mean, I'm a human rights activist, so our job is to look at the vomit of everyday politics and people. And so I find a lot of refuge and relief in looking at alternative universes and seeing how the same human foibles of greed, jealousy, love, competition, all of those things that are just human, when they're transplanted into alternative universes, it gives me a glimpse of futurity, of the fact that it doesn't have to be dystopian. It can actually be a kinder, gentler world, kind of like Star Trek like to portray. But that we're going to be carrying into the future the same things we carried from the past. And so we can't write science fiction universes pretending that we're all going to immediately learn how to love each other and not see color and not have class and access antagonisms and ableism and all of those things. And so I call it symbiotic with my science fiction life. My science fiction life informs my real politic life, and my real politic life informs my science fiction life. I see them as rather seamless. And I've always believed that everything is knowable. It's just the ability to decode what you don't know just hasn't arrived yet. Because I've always believed that, an ancient person 300 years ago seeing an airplane would think it was a sign from God because they just don't understand aerospace technology yet. And so I don't understand psychic technology, for example, but I think it is something that is knowable.
We did open the floor to take a couple of questions from the audience, and so I feel like these questions could be beautifully answered under the rubric of reproductive futurism. So maybe we could start by going to the chat. So Dale asks, I'm wondering what forms of kinship and familial ties will be recreated under the purview of new reproductive technologies. How is the demand for biological ties / nuclear family both becoming more obsolete and also more imperative in these politics? That's an amazing question. So,
and that's an Alexis question.
Okay. Yeah, that is an amazing question. Well, so much to say about kinship. I think that, yeah, it is interesting. Especially, it's interesting to think about in this moment. I mean, I already think a lot about how just the increasing starkness of neoliberalism, like really pushing forward an idea that the state is not responsible for anyone, has this way of underlining family, right? And that since people will have no state support, that the only support comes from these very small kinship networks that are supposed to model the patriarchal family in order to get any slight rewards from the state structure, right? So I feel like in this moment, there's even an intensification of a every household for itself type of feeling and dynamic, because people are literally in configurations that are contained within the walls of where they live, if they have a place to live. And not all of those walls that we live inside contain nuclear families, right? So even hearing the language of pod being used in terms of who is actually through this time of increased isolation, who's deciding like, okay, so we are going to be the people who are going to have contact with each other, is at the same time this isolated piece, but it's also pushing forward language that disability justice activists and folks ending gendered violence and child sexual abuse, I'm thinking especially about Mia Mingus, have been putting forward for quite some time about what does it mean to create support pods, and what does it mean to choose who we're going to actually be vulnerable with, who we're going to reach out to for support. So that is not even bringing in the reproductive technologies into it. It's just like, what do we do with these structures of patriarchal family, nuclear family, and the idea of chosen kinship, which is a very old idea. I was just in a conversation earlier today about Audre Lorde's pod of chosen family that were with her when she got her cancer diagnosis, for example, and how that pod functioned, and that was many decades ago. So I would say the reproductive technologies themselves are not, I wouldn't say they're the key edge around how we structure our lives. I think those structures end up being economic. I think who has economic access to these reproductive technologies is obviously really disparate and runs along the lines of who has access to other forms of healthcare, of well-being, of health, of constructed health, and bio access. and it ends up being reinscribed inside of a story about who is important to each other. How do we make life happen? What does it take to function? And then so there's the macro version of the story, and then there's the micro versions of those stories that play out in our lives. But I know this is reproductive futurisms that, Loretta, you've invited me to be thinking about, but I go back, like I continue to go back to, in Revolutionary Mothering, we talk about what did it mean for lesbian feminists of the 1970s to say, we do not own our children belong to themselves, and that they weren't trying to reproduce a nuclear family just as some lesbians who also own their children as if they were just patriarchs, but they were saying, we're against ownership. We actually want a different form of relation. So I think that what we do with technology continues to be structured by the story we're telling about life. That's what I'll say. I could ramble on for a long time, but I see there's all these amazing questions. So that's what I'll say about that one. And yes, I love that question.
Maybe we could shift to the conversation between you on reproductive futurisms, and then in the last 10 minutes, we'll shift back to the questions in the chat. Yeah.
Actually, I want to push back because I love the questions more than I love anything that's going on in my brain right now.
These are very interesting questions.
These are great questions, but Jina, can we give more time to the questions? Because I actually think the questions are sparking many of the things we want to say.
And I think they're related. They're very much related to the way that I see. I mean, Loretta, you were the first person who said the words reproductive futurism to me. And then the questions that you sent in your email recently feel very aligned with these questions that I see in the chat.
Yeah, so I'll just read out the questions and then we can go from there. So let's see. Ruzzy says, I have a question. I know that Shula Smith Firestone hoped these technologies could free women from the onus of reproductive labor, but now that we've seen them in practice, we understand that they are used to further marginalize people through eugenic BS. What do you think artificial reproductive technologies would look like in a world that wasn't dominated by neoliberal capitalism? Do you imagine them to be potentially liberating or inherently dangerous? Robin says, with the death of neoliberal capitalism, will being human be made completely uncommodified? Like Dale is asking, wouldn't the death of the nuclear family disrupt the way we're sold our reproductive roles? Like literally. Mm-hmm. And then Zoe is building off of these questions and asking, I'm having similar thoughts as Dale and Robin about the current conservative ideas surrounding gender. Changing the ideas of who can carry and give birth to children has the potential to radically disrupt societal ideas of gender, its traditional definition and rules for gender. How do you imagine / have you seen conservative reactions to these new technologies in order to defend these traditional ideas of gender, if this makes sense? All right, so
well, I have one other question or an ask. I want a copy of these questions.
Yes.
Because these are some great questions.
Yeah.
And they're sparking my thinking like a brain explosion right now. So I don't want to lose these precious thoughts. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with Zoom to know how to capture questions. So
I can have I'll make a transcript of the questions available at the end for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, taking off of the first question, before you came, Alexis, I talked about Shulamith Firestone and her desire to remove reproduction from the human body. And she actually foresaw the development of uterine replicators, where we can gestate fetuses outside of human bodies and thus change human relationships in very dramatic ways, because when one is no longer required to put one's body at risk in order to have a baby, What will that do for women's participation in the labor force? What will that do for how we can pre-screen fetuses for what they call defects and anomalies? You know, how does that intersect with the disability justice framework? All of these things are questions that I hope we can answer, or at least begin to address right now, so that we're not blindsided by the rapidity with which the technology is advancing, and so that we're not behind the curve in asking these questions before the technology is popularly available. To me, it's a short human leap from incubators for babies to replicators. It's really just not that large of a technological leap as one could imagine. I think that there's always going to be a risk of eugenics overlaying technology. I mean, scientific racism is one of the ways white supremacy maintains itself. And so, of course, we're going to see scientific racism overlay reproductive technology as it advances, as they map who is worthy of reproduction and who is not, who is worthy of having the families of their choosing and who is not. But even going further to your work, Jina, to talking about who is disposable and who is not, who is to be targeted for disabling and who is not. And so these are the kinds of conversations that we always have to have, because eugenics is such a core feature of white supremacy that we would be naive to think that it is not going to be part of the reproductive futurist conversations as well. I am not one of those that imagine in a reproductive futurist conversation that we're going to be post-white supremacy. I actually think white supremacy will take advantage of all the technological advancements to reinscribe itself. And so we need to anticipate that and not be surprised by that, no more than we should be surprised by the fact that we're trying to build a human rights movement of traumatized people who can't help but impose their traumas on each other. We got to stop being surprised by what is actually predictable. But then, like I said, I'm a left brain person. I tend to see these things as part of the material reality that we have to deal with, rather than the right brain hope that they no longer occur. I'm not sure if that's a good answer, but we need to prepare and anticipate eugenics. I think it is naive to hope that it will go away.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, I mean, I am so like revealing myself as a literary person, but I really still think it's about the story that we tell. So I think that technology exists within inside of a story, and white supremacy is a story. And I think about reproductive futurism. I mean, it's interesting because that was one of the things that was so mind-blowing, because Loretta, when you were like, I want to have a conversation with you about reproductive futurism, just ever since then, it's been months, I was like, you know, I would never have put those words next to each other, because the word reproductive, of course, has the legacy of reproductive justice, but it also is like reproducing the same thing for me. For me, as a Black queer theory scholar, I'm like, oh, reproductive means that the thing is being made again. And then I think about, is it actually the future if that has been reproduced? So then to have the other valence of reproductive, meaning actually, how is it that people come into being, and what is it that's going on with people's bodies, is a layer of that. But there's this way that I'm thinking, what is future? Because yes, there's time after now where the same stories may be reinscribed, right? And therefore we would be able to predict that the same things, eugenics, ableism, all of the things that keep white supremacy intact, would be reproduced, right? But we could also say, if white supremacy still exists, for example, it's not the future. If white supremacy still exists, it's still this, right? So so then it becomes a question, and I love this question of, what would it be? What would the technologies be used for if they were not being used inside of that story? And I think about Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, for example, as one of these novels that my mentor Kai told me to read this, and I was like, what? And it really blew my mind. But that's a complicated future, and it's a complicated book, but I still recommend it. And in that particular future, there is indeed the way that children are made is not inside of the bodies of any particular people. The way that families are structured is that there's 3 co-parents, which my friend Leah Lakshmi Pepsina Summer Sinha was like, right, so everyone can have an 8-hour shift and everyone can have 8 hours of sleep and everybody can have 8 other hours in the day. Like if you had 3 people, anyway. So there is this way that the technology, the reproductive technology in that novel is used to outside of a story of capitalism. It's a story of communalism, and actually all the different things, like they somehow account for, like, they're no longer allergic to mosquitoes. So like mosquitoes aren't a problem because mosquitoes actually aren't a problem, except that we're allergic, like we are itching and allergic to them. Like they can have that little piece of blood, you know what I'm saying? But I don't want to have these bumps all over myself. And they're like, oh yeah, we don't have that anymore. Like we can just be with the mosquitoes. We don't have to find a way to eradicate them. We just are not going to flare up and respond to them in that way. And so it's interesting to think about what even the technologies that we have right now, let alone the technologies that could be created in the future, would be used in what I'm calling the future, which is a time outside of these narratives of white supremacy and ableism and racial capitalism that we exist within. And so this, like, with the death of neoliberal capitalism, will being human be made completely uncommodified. And then the nuclear family, I mean, it's interesting because if you agree with me and you think that it's about the story, we do have multiple stories, and the stories have their own origin points. So the story, neoliberal capitalism, the story of the nuclear family is older than neoliberal capitalism, for example. So it doesn't necessarily say that, okay, well, if this aspect of the story, what we're calling neoliberal capitalism, didn't exist, would that other story about the nuclear family still not exist? We know that these things are caught up in each other. We understand they're interlocking. We understand that the way that power works is intersectional. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if one piece shifts, just like if one piece of technology comes and, you know, pregnancy as we know it doesn't exist, it doesn't mean that that whole rest of the story is not existing, which makes me think about this question of conservative reactions to new reproductive technologies in order to defend traditional ideas of gender. Immediately what came to me is that the conservative reaction that I think impacts people on the most material level, on the most intimate level, and on the most emotional level is actually people shutting people out of their families, right? People becoming parents in a way that other people do not see as lining up with traditional ideas of gender, and saying, that's not my grandchild. That's how it happens. It's actually a reinscription and an exclusion from an idea of nuclear family that is the place where these things get enforced. And we see it already. We see it with someone will say, oh, well, because that baby was born through in vitro, and I don't believe that whatever sperm it was or whatever egg it was is related to me, then this baby is not. They are saying, I get to say the story of what family is, and I'm insisting that it's going to be this other story. I don't care what you did. I don't care if you teleported to Mars and came back. This is my story, and I can exclude you from my story about what my family is. That's the violence. That's one level of the violence. Of course, the state can do can take away people's rights and not give people custody and not give people access to the families that they've created and chosen. But I think that where I see that the conservation of the nuclear idea of family happening is in broken relationships and in refusal to expand the story, to tell a different story, or to include in the story and say, okay, I'm a grandparent, I believe in the nuclear family, and I believe I'm a grandparent to this person. I can say because my kid is a parent to them, or I can say because of these, they use these technologies, or this doesn't, then I'm not. You know, like it's all of these different stories that are existing in different scales, and also do exist in time with each other, that complicate the idea of futurism, period. And then reproductive futurism even layered on top of that.
Well, one of the things that your comments make me think of, Alexis, is that we're going to have to really problematize the reproduction of the colonialist logics, of the white supremacist logic. So even if we were to arrive at some point in a apparently deraced, degendered future, where the markers that we use today of classification are no longer pertinent, if we don't resist the logics that will be carried into the futures, we'll be replicating new taxonomies of how to set up hierarchies and how to decide who's to be protected and who's to be made vulnerable. And so it's actually going at the logics of white supremacy, not as racial manifestations or as gender manifestations, that I think is the more complicated task. Which brings me back to what you named your collective, Ubuntu, because we're going to need a philosophy of human interdependence. And this is something that I've been exploring a lot in not only thinking about reproductive futurism, I'm thinking about how we're practicing Ubuntu in the middle of the COVID crisis. Yet we don't know to name it as a philosophical shift that is taking place in a Sankofa-like moment that that people are hesitating to name, even amidst the deconstruction of neoliberal capitalism or racial capitalism. But I think we who are the practitioners of Ubuntu need to name this ancient philosophy so that it's not like gravity just acting on people, but people understand the science of making these relationships work, real, and be our governing logic.
Yeah, I love that, because I feel like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason that we named our collective Ubuntu was specifically because Nia Wilson, who I think you maybe have met, Loretta, basically taught us about that philosophy and was like, this is, as a women of color led collective of survivors of sexual violence, we wanted to get beyond reaction, right? And we wanted to get beyond a place that said that, you know, I am an individual, and the harms that I've experienced as an individual, I respond to by punishing another individual, basically, who I see as responsible individually for those harms. We understood that the ways that we're connected, we are interdependent, right? But there is, I love what you say about the intentionality of it, because I think that's such a crucial piece. Because in this moment, in a moment where our interdependence because of a contagious virus is impossible to ignore, and we have to act based on it, there still is that decision whether it's going to be a reactionary panic interdependence or whether it's going to be an intentional creative interdependence. So with Ubuntu, for example, we were thinking, okay, so how do we talk about the world that we want to create, right? Like, what do we feel like, we called it sustainable transformative love, right? That's the world that we want to create. We want to live in a world of sustainable, transformative love. That's what Ubuntu is for us. So how do we structure our lives in that way? And even though we were survivors of sexual violence and we wanted to end sexual violence, we couldn't end the statement. It's a very long statement of who we are, but we couldn't end the statement of who we are with what we want to end and what we don't want to exist, even though it's very important to name that. We had to go that step of saying, this is what we want to exist. This is actually what our insight and our genius, which has come through the transformations that we've experienced through the harm that we have lived through and that we have co-survived, we actually can understand that as deep insight into what it would take to create the world that we want. It's the way that many of my favorite theorists think about freedom, and how the people who survived enslavement are the people who had the clearest visionary genius insight about what it could possibly mean to be free. Right, that creative impulse, and that creative impulse continues. So yeah, I strongly agree with that, with understanding that Ubuntu is one philosophy. It is a science. It is a technology of interrelation, and there are many practices and systems of intentional interdependence that exist. And another way of saying that is, sometimes we're inside of a story as if it's just what is, right? As if this is just what it is, this is what the world is, and so now I got to navigate the world because it's this. But when we reveal the fact that this is just a story about life, these things that we've named, neoliberal capitalism is a story, all of these are stories, and there's other stories. There's been other stories. Beyond even that we could create any story, which we can, we are bolstered in our knowledge that we can create a different story by, like you're saying, Loretta Ross, going back and being like, oh, well, what about the story that they told? What about that? How does that help us imagine that we could live beyond individuality, for example, when everything we've been trained into has been to create the individual as the story that we live?
Well, I like the fact, even in the midst of this crisis, that people, a certain sector of the people, are leaning into interdependence without being able to articulate it. Whether it's the person who's looking out for the neighbor who can't access the grocery store, or the healthcare workers who are putting their bodies on the line so that people can live. And it's almost like we're fighting. We see two clearly articulated schools of logic fighting. The social distancing protesters fighting for individualism and selfishness. And the other way humanity is leaning towards interdependence, not only socially and emotionally, but because the virus requires it, you know. And it's a wonderful teachable moment right now for me and I tend to want to see how we can explore what is happening in lived time, because I don't think any of us anticipated this rapid philosophical transformation taking place on our watch, and seeing what we can do so that we help humanity lean into the interdependence mode as opposed to selfish all for me mode. Because I see too many people actually rejecting that, who I would not have seen as potential allies a short while ago.
Yeah, it's almost as if that's what a species would do, right? Like it's almost as if interdependence is natural, right? I agree. I strongly agree. I think that it's beyond an ideology. You know, I think that what's very interesting to me, and I was thinking about this morning when I was thinking about our conversation, I was thinking about exactly what you're saying, Loretta. It's as if I feel like this concerted effort and this concerted funding of these particular protests for people to be like, I have the right to make people sick, or whatever it is that they have on the signs, had to happen because there was this moment where in you know, this incredibly polarized time that we're living in, this politically polarized and polarizing framework that we're engaging, at least that we're engaging through the news media all the time, there was this moment where it was like, oh, wait, everyone's impacted by this. Everybody's impacted by this virus, but also everybody's feeling some similar thing. You know, like, even if it's just as, you know, ridiculous as the fact that people all over the political spectrum are finding the same jokes about what it is to be stuck in your house funny at the same time, right? That's too much commonality. You know, like, what can happen with all of that commonality and just people being like, I'm gonna be a good neighbor, or no, in my own heart, whatever my politics are, it does not feel right to me to just let my neighbor starve because they can't go to the store, or, you know, all of what you said. It's like that feeds into something that I think exists the whole time, just like with this question here, like, just like the Black family exists the whole time, right? Outside of, not necessarily within a narrative that exists, that someone doesn't have to have a particular ideology in order to live out these principles of interdependence that we're trying to name and encourage. And I really do see the, I imagine it. I don't know what y'all think, but I imagine that these people, Koch brothers, whoever they are, you know, these people who fund conservative, extreme conservatism, were like, oh wait, people, like, this is too, like, people have this in common, and we got to, like, bring back that stark division. And so now we have to, like, impose this narrative about the individual right to this, you know, all of that. So yeah, I would strongly agree. And I would say that it very much connects to Robin's question here about Black family. For me, it's connected because I do think about Black family as I experience it as this, in a very similar way to what you're describing, Loretta, as evidence of interdependence, as the actual ongoing everyday making and living in of this world that's supposed to not be able to exist, but does exist and has existed and will exist. There's the function of the story about Black families being broken or dysfunctional, as you mentioned, is in fact to prevent the world from actually taking on what that interdependence looks like. I think that what comes first is the actuality of how people keep each other alive and love each other and exist as a species together. And what comes after it is a story that polices it, right? The story about the Black family is a story that says, we don't want people to think they can be free. We don't want people to think anybody could be related to each other. We don't want play cousins. We don't want sister friends. We don't want any of that stuff, because it doesn't tie into the division.
It's not efficient for the protection of wealth through capitalism.
Exactly, which needs those fundamental divisions. It needs those forms of isolation. So yeah, that's what I would say. So changes in intimate and reproductive relationships. I mean, I feel like Black family been going through and been changing reproductive relationships and intimacy and what it means, what the story is about who we are to each other this entire time.
I'm really appreciating the unfolding of caring relationships in ways that I don't think I paid much attention to. Every time I saw a GoFundMe campaign, I'd get pissed because I'm like, why should we have to contribute to taking care of people when the government is taking our taxes and should be providing this service or whatever? So I contribute, but I'd be pissed, you know, at the same time. Like, I am tired of us providing the social services that we're paying taxes for, kind of thing. But at the same time, I want to lean into the fact that people do feel compassion for each other, and their compassion is mocked as if it is something that they should be ashamed of, as if it is something that is not necessary, a requisite for humanity's survival. And that's also what we need to talk about, because Americans as a whole have wonderful, compassionate impulses in times of crisis that get neatly packed away when the crisis has passed. And I want these compassionate impulses to be the dominant logic, not just when the crisis is here, but as our everyday thing. I mean, yes, I want to rescue and help the people from the tsunami, but let's look at the tsunami of fascism. That's every day that we also need to pay attention to. And we have to have those same logics and those same compassion at this time. I mean, how can people ignore the children at the border and at the same time, claim to be pro-life kind of stuff? So this is an exciting conversation. I hope it platforms a lot more conversations on what I didn't know I was the first person to say reproductive futurism to you. I thought that was going to be something that I was late to the school on, because you Afrofuturists are like so way ahead of the curve. But when you combine the changing terrain of reproductive politics with the scientific developments that we're watching, and the need for a new logic system, a new philosophical system that we desperately long for, that's what made me land on the concept of reproductive futurism.
So I do want to be mindful of time. I'm wondering if both of you feel like you have the capacity to answer this final question about from Dale, who says, I am really interested in how the magnitude of interdependency that was recently thought to be impossible is now happening, and how we are leading into this quote unquote impossibility. As two theorists who work extensively in science fiction and queer of color critique, can you speak to how impossibility is actually a generative site and starting point for futurity/world making?
Well, as a science fiction writer, my job is to make the impossible seem achievable. And as a political activist, I could say the same thing. And so that's why there's no difference between those worlds for me, because the task is the same. We're in the propagation of hope and change. I hate to sound like an Obama clone, but we really are. And so it is by definition generated to think that what we are dealing with today does not have to be the forever that we settle for. That there are immense possibilities, no matter how dire the circumstances seem to be at the time. And I need to raise up the question of cynicism. Cynicism is really one of those things that is death to our imaginings and is death to our ability to survive. And so a lot of people, litter our terrain with their cynical pronouncements that nothing can be done. And we have to fight that impulse within ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I love this question, Dale. I think that impossibility, so as a reader, and that's what I see. Like, I feel like I'm just reading. I'm like, what's the story? What is the story that's being told about this? What's the story that's being told about that? And whatever this particular story is saying is impossible. Not only I agree that it's a generative site and starting point for world making and futurity, and we could just do that, right? We could write the stories starting from what do they say is impossible and just start there. But not only that, I feel like whatever an oppressive narrative within that story, whatever is being said to be impossible, not only is it possible, it exists. Or else you wouldn't have to say it was impossible, right? It's a cover-up. This is what Juanima Lubiano, my beloved teacher and mentor, calls a cover story. It covers something up, right? So like every story is a cover story because it's covering something up. So if they got to say it, if they have to say children cannot be raised in families with only women in them, it's because it's happening. That's why you got to say that it's impossible for it to happen. If it was not happening, you wouldn't even have to worry about that, right? That's a completely different thing. So I do think it's very generative to look at impossibility as this wonderful, it's like the X on the treasure map, honey. It's like, oh, okay. So what I've been told is not imaginable and is not possible. It exists, and I get to find it. I may be finding it within myself. I may be finding it in community. I'm looking in the archives to find it personally, because that's the type of thing that I do. But yeah, absolutely. It is a generative site for finding what it is that already exists.
Okay, so I do want to be mindful of time, and I want to take a couple of minutes just to deeply thank both Alexis and Loretta from the absolute bottom of my heart. This conversation has given me so much life. I just feel utterly transformed by this moment of wisdom and brilliance. And I just also want to say that both of your writing, your intellectual and political work has been so central to my own. I'm forever changed by the understanding of mothering as a technology of transformation rather than a biological imperative. And I find that your intellectual and political work have been important mothers to my own. So thank you so much. This was such,
Thank you.
yes.
Thank you. It's a joy to be a part of this process and this unfolding. And Alexis, I'm always on fire when I'm in conversation with you.
Thanks.
You're the most generative thinker I know.
Watch out, I'm gonna write that on my bio. Loretta Ross said.
And Loretta Ross means it, because I don't idly flatter.
Thank you
y'all
so much. Jina, thank you. Thank you for, first of all, just thank y'all for collaborating. Trevor, Jina, Renyo, like this is such a brilliant pivot that you all made immediately to create more generative space. I feel like it's that intentional Ubuntu interdependence that you all modeled by creating this. It's really an honor to be part of what you're creating. And child, when you said I was gonna get to talk to Loretta Ross, I was like, yeah, you know, like that is like just a light from heaven. Like just, I feel like you are such a miracle in our movements. The fact that I get to live in a world that's been impacted by decades of your work and then be alive at the same time as you and get to be in conversation with you. It's like, I just radiate with goosebumps. I'm so, so, so grateful and so glad that we're able to be together.
Well, like they said in Ghost, ditto.
Oh, yes, thank you both so, so much. And I'm hoping we can figure out future platforms, talk about the future to continue this conversation. And I would love to facilitate that any way that I can.
I had a dream that Smith would have a conference on it until COVID happened.
Yeah.
So maybe we can put that back on the burner at some point.
Yes, I would be so happy to collaborate with you on that possibility, Loretta.
You know, I like doing signature events. Calling in was my last year's signature event. Having this kind of radical conversation, I'd like to make my next year's signature event.
Yes, yes. Okay, I'm putting it on my agenda. So this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. Thank you both so, so, so much. And yeah, I look forward to the future conversations and brilliance that you'll be co-creating. Yeah.
Well, in the company of our sisters.
Yeah.
If we were individually creative, it would be a lot thinner.
That's right, but it's thick. That's right.
I've got to go. I got to get ready for my class, which starts in 7 minutes. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. So I'm going to end the meeting here. And thank you again